There are families that don't hurt you with fists or knives, they hurt you with humiliation. At a grandfather's funeral, 2 cousins walked away with a $41 million estate, the yachts, and a private island. While the granddaughter, everyone treated like an afterthought, was handed a small, crumpled envelope and laughed at in front of the whole room. They say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes blood is exactly what makes you choke. When a plane ticket to Monaco becomes a strange, unmistakable summons, do you swallow the shame to keep the peace? Or do you follow it to find out what they were so desperate to keep hidden? Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next twist in this journey. Now I'd like you to hear what she's been carrying in her heart. There are families that don't need to raise their voices to make you feel small. They just arrange the room a certain way and let you notice where you're standing. My name is Naira Calloway. I'm 28 years old and I teach chemistry at a public high school in Milwaukee. Most days my world is whiteboards dusted with chalk-cracked lab tables and students who think electrons are optional. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. It makes sense to me. Lake Forest never has. My grandfather, Harlan Hargrove, built his empire in Chicago real estate and private investments. His estate sat tucked into the North Shore like it had grown out of the manicured lawns and century-old trees. The driveway curved long and deliberate, as if even the approach demanded respect. Black limousines lined the gravel like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence no one dared interrupt. The funeral didn't feel like grief. It felt like a transfer of power. Men in tailored suits murmured about development portfolios and market shifts between condolences. Women in black silk dresses air-kissed and whispered about what happens next. It was less about burying a man and more about confirming that the Hargrove machine would continue without a glitch. I knew my place in that machine. I was there out of obligation. Blaine Hargrove. My cousin stood near the entrance greeting guests like he had already inherited the throne. He shook hands firmly, spoke in clean bullet points about transitioning assets, and nodded with the calm confidence of someone who had never questioned whether he belonged. His voice carried. He wanted it to. Maris Hargrove. My other cousin had positioned herself where the light hit best. Her black dress probably cost more than my monthly rent. She had her phone angled just right, whispering to her followers about loss and legacy eyes, glossy voice hushed. The moment she ended the live stream, she checked the view count and adjusted her lipstick. Aunt Vita Blaine's mother looked me up and down when I walked in. Not openly cruel, just precise, like she was assessing fabric quality and deciding it didn't match the room. Uncle Clive Maris's father refreshed a stock app while standing beside the flower arrangements. Even at his own father-in-law's funeral, he was watching the market as if a dip in tech stocks might be the real emergency. Then there was my family. My mother, Eloise Harlan's youngest daughter, stood beside my father Dane. She had committed what this family considered the cardinal sin decades ago. She married for love. My father is a master carpenter. He builds custom interiors with his hands. His work is in libraries, kitchens, staircases, things people touch and live with every day. He doesn't build towers with his name on them. He asked for black coffee instead of champagne. Even after washing up, there were faint traces of wood stain beneath his fingernails. I noticed Aunt Veda noticed that. My mother reached up and straightened my collar the way she did when I was 10. "You look fine," she whispered, like she was trying to press me into the right shape for a world that had never quite wanted me. I had spent most of my childhood receiving holiday cards from my grandfather with crisp cash tucked inside. No handwritten notes, no proud of you, just money and a printed signature. When I was 16, I once gathered the nerve to step into his study during a family gathering. The men were talking investments. I thought maybe I could learn something. He didn't even raise his voice when he dismissed me. "This is a private discussion, Naira." Blaine laughed that day. I remember that more clearly than the words. I learned then that in this family, silence was the safest position. I found out my grandfather had died through a group text. No one called me separately. I told myself I just needed to get through the funeral and the reading of the will. Then I'd go back to Milwaukee, back to my students, back to a life that didn't measure worth in square footage. But when the crowd began to drift toward my grandfather's study for the will reading, I saw the family attorney carrying a stack of thick, immaculate envelopes. They were heavy, official, Final. And something inside me shifted. If my grandfather had never really wanted me, why did he insist I be present for this? As I walked down the hallway toward the study, I passed the attorney's assistant. In his hands was a smaller envelope. It didn't match the others. It wasn't smooth and crisp. It looked like it had been crumpled and then forced flat again. I didn't see the name on it, but the image stuck to me like paper against skin. My grandfather's study still smelled like leather and old cigars. The massive oak desk sat at the front like a judge's bench. The room arranged itself without anyone speaking. Blaine took the chair closest to the desk. Maris perched elegantly on the sofa. My parents and I stood near the door as if we were prepared to leave quickly. There is always an order in rooms like that. Mr. Kinsley, the family attorney, adjusted his glasses and began. He opened Blaine's envelope first. Real estate holdings, commercial developments, a controlling stake in multiple ventures, a collection of classic cars housed at the Lake Forest estate. The numbers were spoken out loud, deliberate and clear. Tens of millions in assets. Blaine didn't even try to hide the satisfaction. He nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. Maris was next. The vacation property, the fleet of yachts, a private island off the coast isolated enough to feel exclusive, close enough to market as aspirational. Maris gasped theatrically, pressing her hand to her chest. "Oh my God," she whispered, though her eyes were already calculating brand partnerships. My mother's envelope was thinner, a modest sum compared to the rest, a collection of first edition books, a short message about finding wisdom. It was a polite dismissal disguised as generosity, a final reminder that she had chosen the wrong kind of life. She said thank you anyway. The air in the room felt almost celebratory. Blaine began referencing projected growth. Maris mentioned legacy experiences. Aunt Veda made a remark about how some people are born to manage empires and others are born to guide classrooms. She smiled when she said it. Then Mr. Kinsley reached for the last envelope. It was the small one, the crumpled one. He smoothed it gently before reading my name. Naira Calloway. Silence fell. Not respectful silence, curious silence. I stepped forward and took it. The paper felt worn, as if it had already survived something. Inside was a single first-class plane ticket. Departure tomorrow morning. Route Chicago to Nice, with a connection to Monaco. There was also a small handwritten note. First class. Don't miss the flight. That was it. For 3 seconds, no one moved. Then Blaine laughed. Not a polite chuckle. A full-bodied, uncontrollable laugh. He leaned against the desk for support. "You've got to be kidding me," he managed. "A plane ticket." Maris snatched the ticket from my hand before I could stop her. "It's real," she said, scanning it. "Monaco. That's... wow. I mean, at least it's first class." Her laughter followed Blaine's. "They called it a vacation, a consolation prize, a symbolic gesture to broaden my horizons." Someone muttered that at least I wouldn't have to worry about managing property taxes. I stood there, heat crawling up my neck. I had no argument. On paper, this was exactly what it looked like. They got $41 million in assets, yachts, and island. I got a flight. But something felt off. The envelope in my hand was not like the others. It had been crumpled, then flattened, not accidentally, intentionally, as if someone wanted it to look disposable. I glanced at Mr. Kinsley. For a fraction of a second, his eyes flicked toward Aunt Veda. It was quick, controlled, but it was there. A look that said something had not gone precisely as written. My attention returned to the ticket. The departure time was less than 24 hours away. It wasn't open-ended. It wasn't flexible. It was an order. And the handwriting on the note, though it resembled my grandfather's, was rushed. Messier than the precise script he used in official documents. This was not a gift. This was a directive. As the room dissolved into side conversations and thinly veiled mockery, I folded the ticket back into the crumpled envelope. Blaine's voice carried behind me as I moved toward the door. Well, I guess the old man still knew how to send the ones who don't belong. Far away. I didn't turn around. In the hallway, my phone vibrated in my hand. Unknown number. 7 words. If you go, go alone. Trust no one. I stopped walking. The laughter from the study still echoed faintly behind me, but the words on my screen felt heavier than all the numbers that had just been read out loud. I didn't know if it was a warning meant to protect me, or a trap meant to push me further in. All I knew was that the ticket in my hand no longer felt like humiliation. It felt like a door, and someone, whether my grandfather or someone else entirely, had just pushed it open. Milwaukee has a different kind of quiet than Lake Forest. It doesn't hum with inherited wealth or whisper about acquisitions. It smells like rain on pavement-cut grass and sometimes sawdust when my father leaves the workshop door open. When we pulled into the driveway of the house I grew up in, the tension in my chest loosened just enough for me to breathe again. This house was built from my father's hands. The staircase creaked in the same places it always had. The kitchen cabinets closed with that soft, precise click he'd engineered himself. The windows were sealed tight against Midwest winters because he refused to let cold air win. Nothing here was symbolic. Everything here had been earned. In the backyard, the treehouse still stood. It leaned slightly now, weathered and grayer than I remembered, but it was there. A small, crooked structure my dad built when I was 7. A place where I once believed the world made sense. Looking at it that night, I felt something I hadn't felt all day: belonging. Inside, the three of us sat at the kitchen table. The plane ticket lay between us like a dare. My father broke the silence first. "This is control," he said, his voice steady but tight. Even dead, he's still pulling strings. He didn't say my grandfather's name. He didn't need to. "It's a joke," I said, staring at the words. "First class. Don't miss the flight." He humiliated me in front of everyone. "I'm not flying across the world because he snapped his fingers." "You don't owe him that," my dad said immediately. "You don't owe him anything." I wanted to agree. I wanted to rip the ticket in half and drop it in the trash. But the humiliation wasn't the only thing I felt. There was something else, a question that wouldn't quiet down. My mother spoke softly, but when she did, the room always listened. "I think you should go." My father turned toward her, startled. "Eloise." "I'm not defending him," she said before he could finish. "I'm trying to understand him." She looked at me, then not at the ticket, at me. A week before he died, she said he called me. That stopped everything. My grandfather hadn't called our house in years, not for holidays, not for birthdays, not when I graduated college. He sounded different, she continued, tired, but clear. He said he'd been watching you. My stomach tightened, watching me from a distance. He said you were different from the others. Different. The same word that had always made me feel like an outsider. "What does that even mean?" I asked. "He didn't explain," she said. "He just said, she'll understand when it's time." My father let out a short, disbelieving breath. "That's not an explanation. That's a riddle." "It's not a riddle," my mother said quietly. "It's intention." She folded her hands on the table. "Your grandfather was many things, cold, proud, controlling, but he was never careless. He never did anything without a reason. A first-class ticket to Monaco with less than 24 hours' notice. That isn't random." I looked down at the departure time again. It was aggressive, immediate, not flexible, not sentimental. A command. "I have a test on Monday," I said weakly. "I've got 3 kids staying after school to prep for the science fair. The lab budget is already a joke." "I'll go in," my mother said without hesitation. "You haven't proctored a high school exam in 30 years. She lifted one eyebrow. "Discipline doesn't expire." That made my father almost smile, but he still shook his head. "This is exactly what he would want," he said. "You scrambling, you reacting." Or my mother replied, "This is exactly what he doesn't want. Maybe he wants her to see something before anyone else does." That was the first time the idea shifted in my mind. Not a gift, not a joke, a head start. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at the unknown number again. "If you go, go alone. Trust no one." I typed back, "Who is this?" No response. I showed it to my parents. My father's jaw tightened. "That's not your grandfather," he said. "I know," I answered. That was the part that unsettled me most. Someone else at that funeral knew more than they should have. Someone wanted to make sure I went a very specific way. alone, not calling anyone, not asking questions. "There's something happening under the surface," I said slowly, "and if I don't go, I'll never know what it is." My father leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. "He came here once," he said quietly. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew. "Your grandfather." My mother looked up sharply. "When?" "Couple years back," he said. "Didn't tell you because it was strange and short. He stood out in the yard, didn't come inside, just stood there looking at that treehouse." I felt my throat tighten. "He didn't say anything." "Not really, just asked if you still used it. I told him you were grown." He nodded and left. I had never known that. For a man who barely acknowledged me in person, why would he stand alone in our backyard, staring at a memory from my childhood? The picture of him shifted just slightly, not softer, not kinder, just more complicated. I went upstairs to pack. As I folded clothes into a small carry-on, I told myself this wasn't about money. It wasn't about inheritance or pride. It was about closure. If I didn't get on that plane, the question would sit in my chest forever. Why Monaco? Why me? When I reached into the crumpled envelope one last time to slide the ticket into my bag, something thin slipped out and fluttered to the floor. It looked like a baggage claim receipt. Narrow, almost translucent. I picked it up. Gate pickup arranged. Name must match. I stared at the words. Gate pickup arranged. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. This was logistics. Name must match. My pulse quickened. He hadn't just sent me somewhere. He had arranged for someone to be waiting. And whoever was waiting would not be looking for Naira Calloway. They would be looking for someone else. The drive from Milwaukee to Chicago felt longer than usual. My father drove his old pickup, the faint scent of varnish and wood glue still clinging to the seats. My mother sat beside him, hands folded tight in her lap, as if she were holding something she wasn't ready to say out loud. I sat in the back, the ticket resting against my knee. Lake Forest and Milwaukee felt like two different countries, and I was about to leave both. At O'Hare, the world moved fast and indifferent. Business travelers in tailored coats rolled sleek carry-ons across polished floors. Departure boards flickered with cities I had only ever seen in textbooks. My father walked me all the way to the security entrance. "Going alone doesn't mean you don't have a place to come back to," he said. I nodded. My mother pressed a small pouch into my hand. "Just in case," she said. "In case of what?" "In case this isn't simple." I didn't ask her to clarify. As I stepped into the check-in line, my phone buzzed. Blaine. I almost ignored it, but I opened it anyway. He'd written a long, mocking paragraph about enjoying Monaco on the house. Buried in the middle was a line that stopped me cold. "Make sure you take pictures so everyone knows you actually went. Wouldn't want people thinking you made it up." It wasn't just teasing, it was narrative control. If I didn't go, they would spin it as fear. If I went and stayed quiet, they would question it. They were already shaping the story before it began. I deleted the message. At the counter, I handed over my passport. The airline agent studied the screen, then looked up at me with professional politeness. "Ms. Naira Hargrove." My body reacted before my mind did. "It's Calloway," I corrected automatically. "Naira Calloway." She turned the monitor slightly so I could see. The ticket read, Naira Hargrove. Not a typo, not a system error, a deliberate choice. For a moment I couldn't move. Calloway was the name my father gave me. It was the name on my degrees, the name on my classroom door. Hargrove was a legacy I had never been allowed to claim. "Is there an issue?" the agent asked. I thought of the narrow slip of paper. Name must match. If I refused, I wouldn't board. If I argued, the system would reject me. This wasn't about pride. It was about access. "I'll use Hargrove," I said quietly. It was the first time in my life I had accepted that name in a public system. The gate printed my boarding pass without hesitation. In first class, the seat was wider than any chair I owned. A flight attendant offered champagne before I had even buckled in. A warm towel, a menu with more options than my monthly grocery list. I felt like an intruder in someone else's life. Around me, people spoke in the language I had grown up hearing through walls, investments, acquisitions, tax strategies. The same tone Blaine used when he laughed at me at 16. I almost laughed at the irony. They had mocked me for a first-class ticket, but first class wasn't luxury, it was clearance. As the plane lifted off, my phone vibrated again. Unknown number. When you land, do not call your family. Do not post. Look for a black sign. This wasn't vague anymore. It was operational. Someone knew my itinerary. Someone knew I was on this plane. Someone wanted me to follow very specific instructions. I leaned back in the seat, heart pounding, and remembered Mr. Kinsley's expression during the will reading. He hadn't looked at me like I'd been given scraps. He'd looked at me like a step in a sequence had just been completed. My grandfather hadn't sent me to Monaco to relax. He had sent me to appear, at a specific gate, under a specific name. I pulled the crumpled envelope from my bag one more time. Under the crease along the inside edge, barely visible unless you flattened it just right, was a 6-character code written in tiny ink. Not decorative, not sentimental. A key. I didn't know what it unlocked yet, but I knew this much. I wasn't traveling empty-handed. I was being led through something carefully designed, and I had just stepped through the first door. The plane descended into Nice through a sheet of white light. When the doors opened, Mediterranean air rushed in warm, salt-edged, carrying a brightness that felt almost theatrical. It was nothing like the gray hush of Lake Forest or the steady, grounded quiet of Milwaukee. The sky here was unapologetically blue. The light bounced off glass and water and stone as if the entire coastline had been polished. For a moment, I felt like I had stepped into a different version of my life. Then I remembered the message. When you land, do not call your family. Do not post. Look for a black sign. I kept my phone in my pocket. Inside the terminal, something subtle but unmistakable happened. Instead of drifting into the usual line for connecting flights, my name was called over a small side desk near the gate. Ms. Hargrove. There it was again. Not Calloway. Hargrove. I hesitated, then stepped forward. The woman behind the counter smiled politely and handed me a boarding pass I hadn't asked for. Your transfer has been arranged, she said. You're on the next connection. I hadn't requested priority. I hadn't even known there was a tighter connection available. Someone had moved pieces in advance. The flight to Monaco was smaller. The aircraft skimmed along the coastline, and I could see yachts below like scattered jewelry against the water. Villas clung to hillsides in clean white lines. Everything looked curated, intentional. This wasn't a consolation trip. It was too precise, too coordinated. As we began our descent into Monaco, I felt something shift in my chest. Not excitement, not fear exactly, but the awareness that whatever waited on the ground was not optional. When I stepped into the arrivals area with only my carry-on, the space was smaller than I expected. Quiet, controlled. I scanned the room. Black sign. There were a few drivers holding tablets, but then I saw him. A man in a perfectly tailored black suit standing still in the center of the corridor. He held a simple black placard. Naira Hargrove. No hesitation, no spelling mistake, no question mark, just certainty. I walked toward him slowly. I'm Naira Calloway, I said before he could speak. He studied me with a calm, assessing look that didn't feel surprised. Yes, he replied evenly. Of course you are. He lowered the sign, stepped closer, and leaned slightly toward me. His voice dropped to a near whisper, deliberate and steady. Welcome, heir to... He stopped. Not because he forgot the rest. Because he chose to pause. The word heir landed harder than any number spoken in my grandfather's study. Heir was not a word anyone had ever used in my direction. Not in Lake Forest, not at the funeral, certainly not in front of laughter. I swallowed. Heir to what? His expression didn't shift. That depends on whether you are prepared to understand it. The ground beneath me felt unstable. I'm here because of my grandfather's will, I said carefully. Harlan Hargrove. A flicker crossed his eyes. Here, he replied, he was known differently. A cold line ran down my spine. What does that mean? It means he said that your grandfather lived more than one life. Outside the terminal doors, a black car waited at the curb, engine running, door already unlocked. I stopped just short of the exit. I was in a foreign country. No one here knew me. The only person who had spoken to me so far had addressed me by a name I had never lived under. Every survival instinct told me to step back. As if reading the hesitation in my posture, he spoke again, quieter this time. He stood in your backyard once. Milwaukee. By the treehouse. My breath caught. He asked whether you still climbed up there, he continued. He left without coming inside. My mind raced. That wasn't public information. That wasn't in a news article or social media post. And when you were 16, he added, you walked into his study thinking he might let you stay. The air thinned. Those were not facts anyone outside my family would know. I have files, he said evenly, and I have instructions. This was not random. This was not someone guessing. This was someone briefed. I stepped toward the car. The door closed behind me with a soft, final sound. Only then did he finish the sentence he had begun inside the airport. Welcome, heir, to a structure your grandfather built in secret. He didn't give the name. Instead, he looked out the window as the car pulled away from the curb. Before I say it, he said you need to understand what he created here, and why your cousins can never know. The coastline unfolded outside in impossible shades of blue. I understood then that I had not been sent here for closure. I had been summoned into something capable of breaking my family apart. The drive along the coast felt unreal. The road curved above the Mediterranean cliffs, dropping into clear water that shimmered under the late afternoon sun. Everything was bright and beautiful and impossibly clean, like the world had been filtered through a lens meant to convince you it was harmless. It wasn't. My name is Etienne Morel, the man said as we drove. I have overseen your grandfather's affairs here for many years. Affairs, I repeated. His work, he clarified. The work he never discussed in America. The car turned into a private drive bordered by bougainvillea climbing white stone walls. Ahead stood a villa that looked less like a home and more like something designed to endure. Floor-to-ceiling glass faced the sea. Terraces layered down toward the water. It was beautiful without being ostentatious. This is his, I asked. It belongs to the foundation, Etienne replied. Foundation. The word settled differently than estate. Inside the air was cool and quiet. The first thing I noticed was a wall. Photographs. Dozens of them. My grandfather stood in the center of groups of children at what looked like rural schools. He cut ribbons in front of modest medical clinics. He stood beside teachers, doctors, volunteers. In one photo, he held a small child who clung to his jacket. He was smiling. Not the polite, strategic smile I remembered at galas, a real one. I had never seen that expression on his face. This cannot be staged, I said under my breath. It was not. Etienne answered. He led me to a long table laid with folders. What you saw in Lake Forest, he said, was a fraction, the visible layer. He opened the first file. Legal documents, corporate structures, international registrations. The numbers made the $41 million from the will look like surface currency. This foundation operates through multiple entities, he continued. Completely legal, fully compliant, invisible to anyone without access. How much, I asked, my voice barely steady. Enough to change systems, he said. Not just lifestyles. I felt dizzy. That estate in Illinois, I said slowly, wasn't the whole picture. No, he replied. It was the part meant to be seen. He opened another file. Profiles, Blaine, Maris, detailed accounts of their spending habits, business ventures, social behavior, private remarks recorded through intermediaries. There were notes measured clinical observations about how each reacted when given influence or excess. This is surveillance, I said, my throat tight. It is evaluation, Etienne corrected. Your grandfather believed that inheritance without scrutiny was dangerous. He paused, then slid another folder across the table. My name was on it. Inside were photographs of my classroom. Not invasive, not intimate, but thorough. Me staying after school. Me paying for lab supplies out of pocket. Me cheering at a science fair when one of my students presented a project. I felt exposed and strangely seen at the same time. He watched me, I whispered. Yes. Why? Because you did not chase what he built. I closed the folder. He didn't chase me either. Etienne walked to a small cabinet and retrieved a leather-bound journal. This was written during his final year, he said. The handwriting was unmistakable, precise, controlled, but the words were not. He wrote about regret, about constructing a family culture obsessed with scale and dominance. He wrote about my mother, how she had chosen love over leverage, and how he had interpreted that as betrayal. He wrote about my father's hands, about craftsmanship, about building something that would last even if no one knew the name behind it. And then he wrote about me. She has Dane's hands and Eloise's heart, one entry read. That combination must be protected from what I created. My vision blurred. Protected, not dismissed, not overlooked. Protected. Etienne waited until I closed the journal. The foundation requires a steward, he said, not a beneficiary. A steward. And that's supposed to be me, I asked. If you accept. And if I don't? Then you leave, he said calmly. You return to Milwaukee. The structure continues under limited oversight. The full vision dies quietly. And if I do accept, then you carry it, he replied. And you speak of it to no one. The room went silent. Not your cousins, he continued, not extended family. If they learn of it, they will attempt to claim it. They will litigate. They will reshape it to serve themselves. I knew he was right. I had just watched them measure worth by spectacle. You are asking me to live a double life, I said. I am asking you to preserve one. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated. Video call. Blaine. I stared at the screen. Behind his smiling face, I could see the study in Lake Forest, the oak desk, glasses of liquor on coasters, documents spread out. Monaco treating you well, he asked, smirking. Let's see it. Show everyone what you got. His voice was casual, but his eyes were sharp. Testing. Probing. In that instant, I understood what Etienne meant. One careless sentence and they would smell blood. One hint and the lawyers would follow. I held the phone steady. Just sun and water, I said lightly. Nothing you'd be interested in. His smile faltered for half a second. Don't be mysterious, he said. Family shares. I thought of the journal in my hand, of my father's workshop, of the treehouse in the backyard. No, I said calmly. Family doesn't share everything. I ended the call before he could respond. Silence returned to the villa. The sea stretched endlessly beyond the glass. I looked at Etienne. If I say yes, I said slowly, I'm saying yes to being alone with this. Yes, he answered. And if I say no, you walk away untouched. I thought of Lake Forest, of laughter, of the word air whispered in an airport corridor. I didn't come this far to stay small, I said. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than humiliation. I felt chosen. That night, Monaco was quiet in a way that felt deceptive. The sea below the villa shimmered under scattered lights from yachts anchored offshore. From the balcony, I could see reflections breaking gently against the dark water, as if the world were breathing in slow, controlled intervals. I stood there alone, the leather journal open in my hands. In my mind, 2 rooms overlapped the oak-paneled study in Lake Forest, where they laughed at me, and this white, glass-walled villa filled with photographs of my grandfather smiling beside children and teachers. The sharpest pain wasn't the humiliation anymore. It was the realization that I had spent my entire life feeling unwanted by a man who had been quietly studying me. You understand now why you were summoned, Etienne said from the doorway behind me. Summoned, not invited. I understand that this isn't a reward, I replied without turning around. It was never meant to be, he said. He joined me at the railing. The flight was not a gift, he continued. It was a timing mechanism. I looked at him. If you had not arrived on schedule under the correct name, the access rights would have locked automatically. The authority to activate certain accounts and governance privileges would have shifted to a secondary protocol your grandfather prepared. And that protocol I asked, less ambitious, more cautious, designed to preserve assets but not expand their purpose. The urgency of the departure time suddenly made sense. The insistence on the name Hargrove at check-in wasn't symbolic. It was procedural. Monaco had not been a destination. It had been a checkpoint. I reached into my pocket and handed him my phone. The messages, I said. The unknown number. He scanned them without visible surprise. That line was established by your grandfather, he said. A buffer channel. a way to guide you without exposing me or this location prematurely. But the first message I said pointing to it, trust no one. Etienne's eyes narrowed slightly. That phrase was not in the instruction set. A quiet settled between us. You're saying someone else accessed the channel? Yes. Someone in the U.S., I said. That would be the most logical assumption. My mind raced back to the funeral, the hallway, the crumpled envelope. The envelope, I said suddenly. Etienne nodded slowly and motioned for me to follow him inside. He opened a digital archive on a secure terminal. A scanned logistics file appeared on the screen. The envelope prepared for you, he explained, was sealed and presented with the same formality as the others. It was not intended to appear diminished. But it did, I said. Yes. It was handled prior to distribution. By who, he didn't answer directly. Instead, he showed me a timestamp notation from the law office. An assistant had requested adjustment of presentation for alignment with overall atmosphere. My stomach tightened. That wasn't random, I said. No, Etienne agreed. It was calculated. Someone had crumpled that envelope so the room would laugh before I even opened it. Someone had shaped the narrative before I had the chance to speak. They wanted me embarrassed, I said. They wanted you reactive, he corrected. He pulled up another clause buried deep within the estate documentation. Your grandfather anticipated that someone might attempt to investigate your travel or demand full disclosure of the appendices. On the screen was a separate American trust, relatively small compared to the Foundation's holdings. If any family member attempts to formally trace your itinerary or petition for full documentation beyond the public, will this trust disperses automatically? Disperses to them, I asked. No. It triggers a compliance audit trail, a legal record. It logs the initiating party, the request method, and the chain of representation. A bell system, activated by greed. He set bait, I said quietly. Yes. And it's working, isn't it? Etienne's phone vibrated before he answered. He read the notification, then looked at me. In Chicago, a formal request has already been filed. My throat went dry. By whom? Veda Hargrove. The alarm had rung. Meanwhile, my own phone lit up again. Blaine, Maris. Texts stacked on top of each other. Maris had posted a story implying I was living it up in Europe on inheritance leftovers. She had tagged extended relatives. The comments were already speculating. Blaine called repeatedly, smiling through the screen when I finally answered. Let's see the view, he said lightly. Don't be shy. I could hear glasses clinking behind him. They were circling. They wanted me to confirm something, anything that could justify a deeper search. I didn't argue. I didn't over-explain. It's just a trip connected to the will, I said evenly. Nothing else to divide. No photos, no names, no location tags. Enough truth to reduce suspicion. Not enough detail to trace. When I ended the call, Etienne returned with a small sealed envelope from a safe built into the wall. This was to be opened only after your arrival was confirmed, he said. Inside was a final letter in my grandfather's precise handwriting. He admitted he had constructed a family culture that measured worth in scale and visibility. He called it his greatest failure. He wrote that the assets distributed publicly were designed to satisfy those who equated inheritance with dominance. He wrote that the visible estate was a test. The rest, he said, was atonement. This must be guided by someone not ruled by money, the letter read. If you accept it, you will carry it alone. That loneliness is the price of keeping it alive. My chest tightened. I wasn't being offered wealth. I was being handed responsibility. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Etienne glanced at his phone again. The formal inquiry in Chicago has escalated, he said. They have requested supplemental documentation and travel confirmation. They're digging, I said. Yes. And the system, it has recorded the request. The trap had closed. Somewhere across the Atlantic, my aunt had taken the first bite. And for the first time, I understood that this was no longer about whether I felt small. It was about whether I would step fully into something larger than the family that had laughed at me. Morning in Monaco arrived without drama. The sea looked the same as it had the night before, calm and untroubled. Inside the villa, the mood was anything but. The transfer was not ceremonial. There were no speeches, no symbolic gestures. It was administrative, precise, irreversible. Etienne placed the documents in front of me. Governance authority operational frameworks, confidentiality agreements, internal audit structures. "This is not a lottery," he said quietly. "It is stewardship." I read every line. "I will not leave my teaching position," I said firmly. "The Foundation's support must remain independent of my employment. No conditions attached to my career." He nodded. That was anticipated. "Operational decisions will align with my academic calendar," I added. "Summer and scheduled breaks. That can be arranged." I signed. The ink felt heavier than it should have. Immediately after, Etienne activated a security protocol. "All internal records," he explained, "now require your encrypted digital signature and a physical authentication code." "Where is the second code?" I asked. "In a safe deposit box in the United States, registered under an unrelated entity. It can only be accessed with your confirmation. Even the best attorney in Chicago would hit a wall." He then showed me another file from the American Law Office, the notation about the envelope, the request to adjust presentation. The assistant involved had direct ties to Aunt Veda. "She wanted you provoked," Etienne said, "so that I would challenge the will I finished." "Yes, if you had contested publicly, you would have entered the same legal battlefield as the others, and the Foundation would have remained buried." He nodded. My grandfather had allowed the humiliation to happen, not because he wanted to hurt me, because he needed to see whether I would chase pride or purpose. I flew back to Chicago 2 days later. To anyone watching, it looked like a short, indulgent trip. I didn't tell my parents the details, only that I was safe, that it mattered. The loneliness he had warned about settled quietly around me. At a family dinner in Chicago weeks later, Blaine tried again. So he said casually, "What exactly did Monaco open up for you?" Maris angled her phone subtly. Aunt Veda watched my face like she was waiting for a slip. "Nothing except perspective," I said. "It was eye-opening. That was all. No defense, no denial, no pride. Nothing for them to grab." 6 months later, the changes began quietly at my school. New lab equipment arrived through an anonymous donor program. Science fair fees were covered. 2 of my students received mentorship placements through international academic partners. One earned a scholarship that would have been impossible otherwise. I still graded papers at midnight. I still packed my own lunch. But the difference was no longer subtle. Opportunity no longer depended on what my students' parents earned. Meanwhile, Blaine leveraged properties to fund a high-risk venture that didn't unfold the way he projected. Rumors slipped through business circles. Maris launched an exclusive retreat series on her private island, but operational costs and taxes quietly drained the glamour. Aunt Veda continued pressing for clarity about Monaco filing inquiries that led nowhere but paper trails. I kept the crumpled envelope in my classroom desk drawer, not as a reminder of humiliation, as proof of selection. The real inheritance was never money. It was the chance to build something without turning into what built me. They received what they could see. I received what they would never understand. And I chose to protect it, not out of fear, but because meaning once uncovered deserves guarding. That was the true beginning. And it was enough. When I look back on everything that happened, I realize the deepest inheritance wasn't money, property, or status. It was the quiet understanding that worth isn't always announced in a crowded room. Sometimes it grows in silence. In classrooms, in workshops, in small acts, no one applauds. We don't always get chosen publicly, but that doesn't mean we aren't chosen at all. There are families that measure success by what can be displayed, and there are lives built on what can't be seen right away: patience, integrity, compassion. In the end, we learn that real legacy isn't about who gets the spotlight. It's about what continues long after the lights go out. And maybe that's something all of us are still figuring out, one decision at a time. If this story stayed with you, you're always welcome here. Consider subscribing as a way to be part of this space where we listen, reflect, and share honestly. And if you'd like, leave a few lines in the comments about what inheritance means to you, or about a moment that quietly changed your path. Thank you for spending this time with us. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.